Right, so what we're going to do now is, as I said at the start, we're going to do just a wee recap on topic 1, because obviously we covered a fair amount and it was fairly intense what we're going over. So we're just going to do a wee recap, 20 minutes or so, to go back over that again. So Kim and I will be discussing that. So Kim, over to you.
Thanks very much, Andy. Okay, thanks guys for being with us. So for those of you who were not present at our last session, or if you're like me, your brain is just completely melted in the end of term chaos that has been last week with the exam, and we're going to do a quick overview of the important things that we covered in session 1. So we'll start off with the skills. We can see we've got this wee wheel here, and there were 6 main skills that are covered in any computing science paper. That's analysis, design, implementation, testing, evaluation, and systems. Sorry, in the table.
Yeah, that's right. So obviously we're all pretty familiar with those things. So analysis, design, implementation, test and evaluation are all covered in STD, databases and web, whereas systems questions obviously appear just in the STD section, but not in the other 2. So within these skills, you also have marks in the paper, which are easier to obtain, and some that are trickier. There's more challenging questions in there as well.
Yeah, that's right, Andy. There's actually 50% of the marks in any paper which are allocated to these easier kind of C-band questions, as we call them, whilst there's 30% of the paper are the more complex A-band, higher order thinking questions.
Yep. Last time we covered quite a lot about Bloom's taxonomy and how there were different types of understanding which the pupils would be required to answer different styles of questions, some more challenging than others, depending on whereabouts in the taxonomy that the question would link to.
Yeah, and then we looked at some of the kind of more common command words that come up in the computing science papers, and as a group discussed where they fall under the Bloom's categories. And you can see here, for example, that the easier sort of remembering are usually the C-type questions that start with things like state, for example.
Yeah, and obviously we've got more complex questions that would start with evaluate or compare.
And we took a look at some of the questions last time as well and asked participants to sort of vote on which skill they thought was being assessed in the question and how many marks the question are worth. So just to kind of get us started today and get our brains working, we thought we'd have another little go of that so we could refresh our memory on how that worked, especially if anyone wasn't here. So here are our questions.
Okay, so we've got a question stem and 3 sub-questions. Each one has been coded with a colour. Using the dot voting options at the bottom, grab the corresponding colour to each question and vote on which skill you think it's relating to and how many marks you think it's worth. So obviously we've got blue, yellow and pink for the 3 questions, and just decide where you would vote for them.
Just to be clear, if you think the first question with the blue dot is like a design question and it's worth 4 marks, then take a blue dot from the voting at the bottom and move it to the box that says design, and then 1 to the box that says 4. Yeah. So guys, what we'll do is we'll just give you a couple of minutes or so to complete this task and see if we all agree with what the 3 questions are. And then we'll continue on to the next little bit. So go and have a go at some of the voting now. Grab the dots at the bottom and put them in the box you need. Great, so we'll go over each of these questions one at a time, but what I've done is, to make it a little bit easier, I've changed the order slightly to reflect sort of the correct sequence that they would be in, because most questions follow the software development process, okay? So we're going to start by looking up what was the last of the 3 questions. So we'll start by uncovering the marking scheme first to let you have a look at it. Now, straight away, the first thing you'll be noticing here is that this is obviously a 1-mark question, which most people, I think, said, for those of you who did vote, I think most people said that in the last slide. The skill in this case was a bit less obvious, actually. A lot of people voted for implementation in the first one, but actually that is incorrect. So if we remove the skill was actually design. So data types come under the design section of the arrangements.
Yeah, but what we haven't talked about yet, Kim, is the level of difficulty of this question. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I thought instead of telling everyone the answer straight away, we could maybe put this to a little vote using some of the Miro emoji reactions, okay? So this is the voting icons we're going to use. I'm going to pop up the wee key on the screen. And I want you to use a thumbs up emoji if you think it's a C-band question. I want you to use an on fire emoji if you think it's an A-band question.
Okay, I see in the key here there's another blown head emoji with a mark. What's that for?
Oh yeah, well, I thought we could just use the blown up head emoji for a couple of things. Basically, if we have no idea, like what on earth, or fill in that comment, whoever you see appropriate.
Right, I think that makes sense. Hopefully we've got people voting here, so it's all good.
Yay.
Loads of votes for C. Okay, right. Just
Okay.
a minute. I don't think anyone else.
Right, okay, so most people seem to recognize this was a C question. Unveil, please. Thank you. The command word state tells you that it is this nice, easy remember style question, is definitely under a C category. So you guys absolutely smashed that one. Well done.
Okay, good. Right, let's go on to the next question. So if I'm remembering correctly, this is the first of the 3 questions that we looked at earlier on.
Yeah, that's right, Andy. This one was actually the one that kind of confused a lot of people. So the skills people said for that one were everyone kind of said the same thing, but the marks, they went a little bit different. So right away, I think people were able to tell that it was implementation.
Okay, right. So this is implementations. This is a classic standard algorithm question for input validation. When people were voting in the marks for this one, it was mainly 4 that they were going for, and I'm presuming that's right.
Yeah, a lot of people actually voted for 2 as well, but yeah, let's see what it comes up with.
Okay, right. Okay, so there we go. It was 4 marks for this one. 1 mark for the conditional loop, 1 mark for the condition, 3rd mark asking for input inside the loop, and a final mark for the error message. Okay, so not a big surprise with that one.
No, well, actually, I think there was kind of mixed responses to that one. But yeah. This one, however, is where it gets a little bit more difficult for voting, because the first question was obviously 1 mark, right? But now we're looking at 4 different marks. So we're going to use the same voting buttons as before. But what we'll do is, instead of just saying overall for the question, I think what we'll do is we'll look at each of the marks in the marking scheme. So I'm expecting more kind of mixed results for this one. I think us, remember, as a group, we even found it really tricky coming up with what was the A marks and the C marks when we were doing it as a tutor team. So I can imagine it's tricky for everybody else as well.
Yeah, that's right. So I remember this one well. So what we'll do is, if you want to have a vote just on the very first mark that's listed in the marking instructions there, so the conditional loop, do you think that is a C or an A? Or you don't know? Okay, so we'll give people a wee minute. Lots of votes for...
Most people are saying C.
Yes.
Okay, what about the second mark, the correct loop condition? What are we thinking for that? Remember, blown heads is just no idea, or a B or somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, so lots of votes for A here.
Okay.
Okay, anyone else to vote? No, doesn't look like it. Right, and 3rd mark for having the input within the loop. What do we think of that one? Okay, lots of C there.
Interesting. Okay, and finally, the 4th mark of the error message. What are we thinking for that?
Okay, some don't knows, some C's.
Or some middling ones. Okay, so mixed responses overall, leaning towards most of the marks being for C there, I would say. Would you agree, Andy?
Yes, loads and loads of those.
Yeah. So these are the correct answers.
Okay, so there's 1 for C, but there are actually 2 marks allocated as A marks. Am I reading that right, Kim?
Yeah, that's right. So the breakdown kind of works as follows. The error message, which most people voted as a C, is the actual C band kind of part of the question. I think we would like to think that all pupils would recognise that it was an input validation, because the word valid is in the question. And worst case scenario, even if they did that classic thing that the NAT4s quite often do, which is they just put an if statement in to state the error, and then it'll ask again just once, they would still get that mark.
Yep, and that can be a really common and frustrating thing when pupils do that and miss a loop, and then when they test it, they don't necessarily spot it either. But anyway, what about the A marks? Where were they allocated?
Well, we had a little bit of back and forward with this, but about what was the most difficult skills, and knowing to put the input inside the loop and then getting the condition right. That's the bit that always trips pupils up. Do you know what I mean? Even more so as well when you're using a language, especially like us with Visual Basic, where the condition can be either at the start and the end. I know you don't have the option for that in Python and some other languages, but that makes it a bit more complicated.
And that's fair. So what about the conditional loop?
I think the conditional loop is this weird one. It kind of falls into the weird middle category. Pupils obviously need to recognise the question is asking for input validation and then know that they require to apply a conditional loop in that scenario, which I personally think, and we kind of decided as a group, that's slightly trickier than like a justice, like for a C candidate person.
Okay, so that makes sense. So we don't actually register that as anything then?
No.
We're between a C and an A. Okay, right, let's move on to the last question now.
Okay.
Okay, right, so for this question, most people went for 3 marks, which is reasonably obvious, 1 for each gap in the table.
Let's take a look at the marking scheme and see if you were right. Looks like we were. The skill, I think, here obviously is pretty obvious because it's clearly a testing question, so we can uncover that as well. Especially when the table mentions the word normal and exceptional. However, the interesting part of this question is, what do we think about the difficulty of these questions?
It looks pretty straightforward to me, but let's see what everyone else thinks. So for suggesting a set of normal values, what are the thoughts? Okay, so what would be a set of normal values? Is that a...
Mostly thumbs up, it looks fit.
Mostly thumbs up for that one, so most people saying C for that one. Okay, and then what about for providing just a single word extreme to go in between normal and exceptional? Lots of C's again. Okay, right, and then finally we're down in the bottom row for the exceptional values. So what about for suggesting a set of exceptional values? It's lots of C votes again.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so most people are thinking C's across the board here. And truthfully, this could have easily been a fully C mark question. It asks you about all 3 of the different testing types. You only have to remember the specific term, the name for one of them. And the examples given for the extreme help greatly with the generation of the data for the normal data in the bit above. So it's the exceptional bit that stands out, though, as being a tiny bit more complicated. Can you spot the reason why, Andy?
Yeah, I'm thinking is it because there's additional guidance and it says that all values must be numeric, as in the question. Okay, so
yeah, that's it. The additional guidance is always a giveaway. So it's a more difficult spot, but in the wording of the question, it clearly states that the program is tested with a range of numerical values. So words like Kim or like hello world would be accepted as exceptional data for the program, but they wouldn't be appropriate for the context of this test in particular.
Okay, so that's all making sense, but I guess it's not an A mark either because it's probably not that challenging.
Yeah, correct. Again, it would be listed as 2 C marks, and then the other 2 would kind of fall into this weird middle category. I suppose be called a B, but isn't really officially called a B by the SQA.
Okay, right. So 2 C marks and then 1 of the other ones.
Yeah, other. Yeah. That's correct. So we will look at how it pans out overall.
Okay, let's do that.
Fab. So what I've done here is I've basically rearranged the questions all onto one page. And when you look at the spread of the skills, you can see easily where the gaps were. So if we were making this into, for example, a homework sheet or as part of an assessment, what you might want to do is then add in some analysis questions or evaluation questions that would help balance it out a bit.
Okay, and let's not forget, we could also include more design questions because according to the rubric, 30% of any questions have to be design related.
Yeah, that's very true. And also, what have you noticed about the difficulty of the questions?
No, I've not really spotted anything. What about them?
Well, of the 8 marks in total, 50% of them are C, which is right, as it should be, and 25% of the A's, which means that we aren't actually quite far off the balance that's required. 30% of A's is needed, so they would just kind of need to be considered when writing the other sections of the paper, how difficult you make those questions, you know?
Yeah, and obviously this can seem a bit complex initially because we're talking about A and C level questions and getting the balance and the mix of them right. So no wonder people start to not feel fully confident in doing it, but it's a lot to just practice and keep on trying.
Yeah, I know, you're not joking. I like it just bamboozles me how people put these together all the time. So let's have a look over some of the most important points to take away from this and the stuff we looked at last time before we start writing questions of our own, okay?
Okay, Right, so I always think one of the best ways for question writing is by trial and error. Okay, so the more you do and the more you practice, the better you become. But you've obviously got to bear in mind it's a difficult skill in any question paper, like the SQA past papers have gone through many iterations and reviews, and I've had many pairs of eyes looking at them. And obviously, so therefore there's lots and lots of reasons why the final outcome becomes the way it is. Okay, so it's quite a difficult thing to replicate if you're on your own, just working on it.
Yeah, that's right. So what we've done is we've kind of noted down some of what we as a team think are the kind of most important points to take forward. So I'll have a look at ones on the left, Danny's going to have a look at ones on the right. So the first thing you want to think about is a skill sequence. So the questions asked must be in the order of the software development process. Although a question itself might not cover all of the skills necessarily, it is important to break, it is possible at some points to break the software development kind of process if you want to, but that's only if you're introducing a new requirement, perhaps like halfway through a question. Another important thing is to make sure the context is appropriate. You need to really know your audience. The scenario must be easily understood by 15, 16, 17-year-old pupils. And regardless, you must not assume any prior knowledge about something. So be really explicit with your examples. For example, if you're talking about a pack of cards, you'd need to say that there's 52 cards in a pack of cards and not assume that pupils have that knowledge. It's really important to create the marking instructions as you go along. Mark allocation is so important as it influences the level of detail that you're expecting in response from the pupils. So we encourage you to write the marking scheme as you go along, and you can always add to it. And there are times that candidates give unanticipated answers, for example, but they could still be correct. So it's really important to kind of build that in as you're coming up with your marking schemas and when required. The next thing you want to think about is your command words and making sure you use appropriate ones. So words that pupils have seen before in previous papers. It helps them to kind of allow them to understand what it is they're going to be answering. And if they practice that, they'll have gained confidence in what they need to do to answer specific question styles. And then tracking difficulty as well. It's important to keep an eye on what level your questions fall under, because if you end up with an assessment or homework that's got too many C questions, or in turn too many A questions, it's not going to give you or your students a real true reflection of how they're progressing through the course, because you might think they're doing better or worse.
Okay, that's great, Kim, thanks. Right, I'll go through the right hand side of the diagram now. Right, another important factor is don't give anything away. So it can be really tricky, particularly advanced higher and higher question writing, not to write answers or not to write parts of questions that would then form part of an answer for someone later on or elsewhere in the paper. So that's a really quite a challenging thing, is not to give anything away that could form someone's answer to a different question. Only assess content at that appropriate level. So you can, in a higher paper, you can obviously allocate marks from National 5 and vice versa. And this also applies to advanced higher too. Breadth of the content's really important, because you have to try to make sure that as much of the course specification is assessed as possible. But you also have to be careful there's no double penalising of pupils. So if there's a pupil in a situation where they have to answer 2 separate questions, but they're based on a single piece of knowledge, then obviously they'd be losing 2 marks rather than 1 there for not knowing 1 fact or 1 piece of knowledge. So that's obviously a bit unfair in them. Right, we speak all the time about question writing and we talk about the question paper and so on, but actually there's not actually any English teacher would tell us there's not actually any questions on it. They're all statements, they're all instructions to the pupils. So it's instruction with a command word telling them to do something. And finally, we're obviously, as we hinted at or discussed earlier on, there's a variety of skills that need to be assessed. Okay, so we have to cover a whole range: analysis, design, implementation, testing, evaluation, and also computer systems. As we had a look at earlier on as well, there's a weighting for each one. So that's quite a tricky part, to make sure you get the balance right in terms of a question paper there. Obviously, it's more important where it's a prelim, where you're trying to cover the whole course rather than just a homework or a class test. Okay, right, so that was a quick summary of whirlwind through what we got through last session, with some kind of new bits of information and new bits of learning thrown in too.
It sure was. I was thinking it might be useful though, as it's important to have this information in the back of our brains as we're building a piece of work up for our pupils. I mean, if all of our class assessments, homework tasks and classworks was to reflect the kind of correct balance of skills and complexity of questions, then we're much more likely to get this better reflection of how they're performing and help them, the pupils, to understand where we need to fill the gaps.
Okay, that's right. Kim, thanks for that. Right, we're going to hand over to Colin now, and we're going to look at a bit more detail about how we build up some of these essential question writing skills.